Marcus Reynolds spends his life raising the daughter he found abandoned on the side of the road as a newborn. Life is hard, but he believes kindness matters more than money. During his shift at a luxury jewelry store, Marcus watches his co-workers humiliate a poor, elderly woman and try to throw her out. He is the only one who stands up for her, and he is fired on the spot. What Marcus does not know is that the woman he just protected is the mother of the most powerful CEO in the company. Could one act of kindness change everything? Stick around and hit follow, because this story is about to take a turn you will not see coming. Marcus Reynolds had learned a long time ago that the world rarely rewarded patience, yet he had never once let that truth harden him. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with tired eyes that still softened whenever his daughter walked into a room. 10 years earlier, on a night when the rain had come down so hard the streets looked like rivers, Marcus had been walking home from a late shift when he heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was thin and frightened, coming from a cardboard box tucked beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy. Inside, wrapped in a soaked towel, was a newborn girl no one had claimed. He carried her to the hospital that night, and for months afterward he tried to find out who she belonged to. Filing reports waiting by phones that never rang, hoping someone would come forward. No one ever did. When the adoption was finally finalized, Marcus signed his name with a hand that trembled not from fear, but from a strange and sudden certainty that this child was meant to be his. He named her Maya, and from that moment on, every decision he made in his life ran through the simple question of what was best for her. To keep a roof over their heads, Marcus worked the sales floor at a jewelry store owned by Onyx Group, one of the most prestigious names in the city. It was not the kind of job that paid well for the hours it demanded, but it was steady, and steady was what mattered most to a single father raising a daughter on his own. Most mornings, Marcus arrived before his shift started, just so he could double-check the displays, greet the early regulars by name, and make sure everything looked the way his manager wanted it to look. He never complained about the early hours because the alternative, sleeping in and losing the job entirely, was not a risk he could afford to take. His manager, David Wren, had never cared much for that kind of effort. From the beginning, David treated Marcus with a thinly veiled irritation that never fully explained itself, though everyone on the floor seemed to understand it anyway. Marcus was polite, where David was curt, patient, where David was dismissive, and customers noticed the difference. It embarrassed David in a way he could not admit out loud, so instead he found smaller ways to remind Marcus of his place, cutting his hours, when he asked for time off to attend Maya's school events, mocking him in front of the other staff for choosing his daughter over what David called real commitment to the job. Marcus rarely responded to any of it. He had built his life around a simple belief that kindness cost nothing and meant everything, and he was not about to abandon that belief just to satisfy a manager who measured worth in commissions. Besides, he had bigger things to think about. Maya was growing fast, asking harder questions, needing new shoes every few months, and Marcus intended to give her whatever stability he could manage, even if it meant swallowing his pride at work more often than he would have liked. What none of the staff at the store knew was that Onyx Group's owner had a habit of testing her own company from the inside. Victoria Carter, the CEO, was only in her mid-30s, yet she had built a reputation as one of the sharpest and most demanding executives in the industry. She rarely visited the retail locations herself, but her mother, Eleanor Carter, did something far more effective. Every few months, Eleanor dressed in worn, unremarkable clothing and walked into one of the company's stores like any ordinary customer, quietly watching how the staff treated people who did not look like they belonged. It was on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon that Eleanor walked into the very store where Marcus worked. She wore a faded coat, scuffed shoes, and carried an old handbag that had clearly seen better decades. She moved slowly through the aisles, pausing at the glass cases, and it did not take long before David noticed her from across the floor. "Can I help you find something?" David said, though his tone made it clear he already assumed the answer was no. Eleanor smiled politely and asked to see a few pieces near the front counter. David exchanged a look with two other salesmen nearby, the kind of look that needed no translation. One of them laughed under his breath and muttered something about wasted time. David leaned closer to Eleanor, his voice dropping into something sharper. "This isn't really the section for browsing," he said. "Maybe try somewhere more suited to your budget." The words landed exactly as intended, and Eleanor's expression flickered, though she did not argue. She simply stepped back, her hands folding in front of her, the quiet dignity of someone who had been humiliated before and had learned not to let it show too openly. It was that quiet, more than anything, that caught Marcus's attention from the other side of the store. He crossed the floor before he had fully decided to pulling a chair from near the counter and setting it down gently beside her. "Please have a seat," Marcus said. "Let me get you some water." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. Marcus returned with a small cup of water, then knelt slightly, so he was at her eye level rather than towering over her the way David had. He began showing her a few pieces from the case, not the expensive showpieces meant to impress, but simple, elegant items he thought she might actually like. He listened when she spoke, asked what occasions she had in mind, and treated her exactly the way he treated every other customer who walked through the door, rich or otherwise. Eleanor finally reached for a modest bracelet, admiring it for a long moment, before her expression shifted into something quieter, almost embarrassed. "I'm afraid I don't have any money with me today," she admitted. "I only wanted to look." Marcus did not hesitate. He reached into his own wallet, pulled out what little cash he had left for the week, and pressed it gently into her hand. "For a taxi home," he said. "That's all, no strings attached." It was such a small gesture in the grand scheme of the store's daily transactions, yet it was enough to draw David's attention from across the room. He stormed over his face, already flushed with anger, demanding to know what Marcus thought he was doing giving away money to a stranger on company time. Marcus tried to explain, but David was no longer interested in listening. "You're done," David said loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Pack your things and get out." The words hit harder than David probably intended, though Marcus did not argue. He simply nodded, collected his jacket from the back room, and walked out into the afternoon light without looking back, his mind already racing toward the harder question of how he would explain this to Maya that evening. Eleanor watched the entire exchange from her seat, and when the taxi Marcus had paid for finally arrived, she did not go home immediately. Instead, she asked the driver to take her to her daughter's office, still holding the folded bills in her palm as though they were something worth protecting. Victoria was in the middle of a budget review when her assistant told her that her mother was waiting downstairs, insisting on seeing her immediately. She met Eleanor in a private lounge on the top floor, and it did not take long before Eleanor described exactly what had happened, down to the tone David had used and the exact amount of cash Marcus had handed her without being asked. "Pull the security footage," Victoria said to her assistant, her voice flat in the particular way it became whenever she was genuinely angry. "Now!" The footage confirmed everything. Victoria watched in silence as David mocked her mother, in front of customers, watched the moment Marcus crossed the floor to help her, watched him kneel down and speak to her as though she were the most important person in the building instead of the least. She watched him being fired for it, watched him leave without protest, without demanding an explanation, without asking for anything in return. Victoria sat back in her chair, jaw tight, and turned to her assistant. "Find him," she said. "Tonight if you can." That evening, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, staring at a stack of unpaid bills he had been avoiding for weeks. Maya sat across from him, finishing her homework, occasionally glancing up to study his face the way children do when they sense something is wrong, even if no one has said it out loud. "Everything okay, Dad?" she finally asked. Marcus forced a small smile and told her everything was fine, that he would figure things out the way he always did. He was still turning the day over in his mind when there was a knock at the door. He assumed it was a neighbor or perhaps a landlord looking for rent, and he was entirely unprepared for the woman standing on his doorstep, introducing herself as an assistant to Victoria Carter, CEO of Onyx Group. Marcus's first instinct was to close the door. He had heard enough corporate names in his life to know that nothing good usually followed them, and the last thing he wanted was to be dragged into some kind of public relations apology tour after being humiliated and fired in front of his coworkers. He told the assistant politely but firmly that he was not interested. That night, after Maya had gone to sleep, Marcus sat alone in the quiet apartment, turning the offer over in his mind. He thought about his pride, about how many times in his life he had refused help, because accepting it felt like admitting defeat. He thought about the years of double shifts, the months he had gone without new clothes so Maya could have hers, the quiet fear that lived under every decision he made about money. Pride had gotten him this far, but pride alone would not pay for Maya's future. The assistant returned the next morning, this time with a simple clarification that changed everything. This was not charity, she explained. Victoria was offering him a real position within the company, a chance to build something rather than survive month to month at the mercy of managers like David. Marcus listened, and for the first time since the assistant had first appeared at his door, he allowed himself to consider it seriously. He looked over at Maya, who was quietly eating breakfast at the counter, completely unaware that the trajectory of both their lives was about to shift. Marcus thought about the years ahead of her, about school, about the kind of future he wanted her to have, one that did not depend entirely on his ability to survive one more bad shift at a retail counter. "Tell Miss Carter I'll come in," Marcus finally said. It was not surrender, and it was not charity accepted out of desperation. It was a decision made the same way Marcus made every decision that mattered with his daughter's future, sitting quietly at the center of it. Marcus's first week at the Onyx Group headquarters felt like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else. The building rose 30 stories above the street, all glass and quiet elevators, and every person who passed him in the hallway seemed to move with a kind of certainty he had never needed in his old job. Victoria met with him personally on his second day, and instead of offering him a check or a gift the way he had feared, she laid out the actual terms of an executive assistant position, complete with a salary, that made Marcus sit back in his chair for a moment before he could respond. Even then, when Victoria mentioned a car and a bonus on top of the salary as a personal thank you for what he had done for her mother, Marcus shook his head. He told her plainly that he had not helped Eleanor expecting anything in return, and that accepting extra gifts now would make the whole thing feel like something it was never meant to be. He said the only thing he wanted was the kind of job that would let him look Maya in the eye one day and know he had earned every bit of what he gave her. Victoria studied him for a long moment, after that the way someone studies a person they are not used to meeting. Eleanor, for her part, had taken an immediate liking to Marcus that only grew stronger the more time she spent around him. She began stopping by the office on small pretexts, bringing pastries she claimed were left over from some event lingering near his desk, long enough to ask about Maya's day at school. Marcus found himself looking forward to those visits more than he expected, though he never let himself think too hard about why. Not everyone in the building shared Eleanor's warmth. Richard Ashford, one of the company's senior executives, had spent years positioning himself as the natural partner for Victoria, both in business and eventually in marriage, believing that a union between them would finally hand him the kind of control over Onyx Group he had wanted since he first joined the company. In the beginning, Richard barely registered Marcus as a threat at all, dismissing him as a temporary hire, brought in out of gratitude, someone who would fade into the background once the novelty wore off. That assumption did not survive very long. Marcus proved to be sharp in ways that surprised people who judged him only by his background. He caught scheduling conflicts before they became problems, remembered details about clients and staff that others forgot, and treated every person in the building, from the executives to the cleaning crew, with the same steady respect he had once shown Eleanor in the store. Victoria began asking for his opinion in meetings that had nothing to do with his official duties, and more than once she adjusted a decision after hearing his perspective. It was a small shift, at first barely noticeable, but it was the kind of shift that people like Richard were trained to notice immediately. The turning point came during a quarterly strategy meeting when Victoria overruled a recommendation Richard had spent weeks preparing, choosing instead an alternative approach that Marcus had mentioned to her in passing the day before. Richard sat through the rest of the meeting with a composed expression, but the moment it ended, he watched Victoria and Marcus continue talking by the window long after everyone else had filed out their conversation easy in a way that had nothing to do with business. It was not jealousy alone that gripped Richard in that moment. Two members of the board had recently begun asking questions about succession planning, wondering aloud whether Onyx Group needed fresh leadership perspectives outside the usual executive circle, and Marcus's name had come up more than once. Richard understood immediately what was at stake. If Victoria's affection for Marcus deepened, and if the board began seeing him as more than just her assistant, both the marriage Richard had been quietly engineering for years and the influence he had built inside the company could collapse at the same time. Richard needed an ally who already resented Marcus, and he did not have to look far. David Wren had been sitting at home for weeks since his outburst at the store, technically still employed by Onyx Group, but stripped of any real responsibility after corporate reviewed the footage of his conduct toward Eleanor. David blamed Marcus for all of it, certain that if Marcus had simply let the old woman leave quietly, none of this would have happened to him. When Richard reached out with a private offer promising to have David reinstated as a regional manager if he helped deal with what Richard called the Marcus problem, David did not hesitate. Their first move was simple and required almost no risk. Richard began feeding quiet suggestions to a few reporters he trusted, framing Marcus as a man who had used his own adopted daughter as leverage to work his way into Victoria's life, twisting the story of Eleanor's rescue into something calculated rather than kind. Within days, the narrative spread through the company and then into the press headlines, questioning whether the CEO's new executive assistant had engineered the entire jewelry store incident from the start. Marcus read the first article at his desk early one morning, his stomach tightening as he scrolled through comments from strangers who knew nothing about him or Maya, yet felt entitled to judge them both. He thought about deleting the article and pretending he had not seen it, but Victoria had already read it herself by the time he looked up. She called a company-wide meeting that same afternoon, gathering staff from every department into the largest conference room in the building. Marcus stood near the back, unsure whether he was meant to be there at all, watching, as Victoria took her place at the front of the room with the same composed authority she carried into every negotiation. "I want to address the rumors directly," Victoria said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "This man helped my mother when every single person around her chose to humiliate her instead. He asked for nothing in return, not money, not a title, nothing. I will not stand here and let this company turn kindness into scandal because it makes for an easier headline." The room fell into an uneasy silence, and Marcus felt every eye shift toward him at once. Some employees nodded quietly, clearly relieved to hear their CEO defend him so directly, while others exchanged glances that made it obvious the rumors had already done their damage. By the end of the day, the staff had visibly split into two camps, one that respected Victoria's judgment without question, and another that whispered about favoritism and wondered how far she would go to protect a man she had known for only a few weeks. For Marcus, standing in that conference room and hearing Victoria defend him so openly stirred something he had not expected. He was used to being invisible in rooms like that one used to being dismissed the way David had dismissed Eleanor in the store. Watching Victoria stake her own credibility on his character left him with a feeling he could not immediately name something warmer than gratitude and more complicated than simple respect. Victoria felt it too, though she was far more careful about acknowledging it even to herself. She had spent years building walls around her personal life, learning early that vulnerability in her position often became a weapon in someone else's hands. Yet she found herself thinking about Marcus at odd hours, replaying small moments from their conversations, noticing the way he spoke about Maya with a tenderness that had nothing to do with performance. It unsettled her, though not in a way she wanted to run from. The public defense did not end the story the way Victoria had hoped. Photographers began waiting outside Marcus's apartment building, hoping to catch a picture of the man at the center of the controversy, and one afternoon a reporter followed Maya nearly all the way to her school before a neighbor intervened. When Eleanor heard about it, she insisted over Marcus's objections that he and Maya move into the family estate for a while somewhere with gates and security that could actually keep a 10-year-old girl safe from strangers with cameras. Marcus resisted at first, unwilling to let his life be rearranged by someone else's money, but the sight of Maya flinching at a car slowing down near their building settled the argument for him. At the estate, Maya had begun forming her own bond with Victoria, unaware of the tension building around her father at the office. Victoria made a point of joining them for dinner most evenings, first out of a sense of responsibility for uprooting their lives, then simply because she wanted to. Maya would tell her about school assignments and friends about a science project she was building for a class fair, and Victoria found herself listening with a genuine interest that surprised even her. There was something steadying about Maya's easy trust, something that reminded Victoria of the kind of family life she had rarely experienced growing up in boardrooms and business dinners. None of that warmth reached Richard, who watched the growing closeness between Marcus's family and Victoria with mounting urgency. The rumors alone had not been enough to remove Marcus from the picture, and Victoria's public defense of him had only strengthened his position inside the company. Richard understood that subtler tactics had failed, and he began turning his attention toward something far more direct, something that would not simply damage Marcus's reputation, but eliminate him from the company entirely. He met with David again, this time in a private office late in the evening after most of the staff had gone home. The plan they settled on was reckless, but Richard had access to something David did not: security clearances tied to the company's most valuable inventory, including a set of diamond pieces recently acquired for an upcoming showcase collection. If those pieces disappeared, and if the evidence pointed toward Marcus, no amount of goodwill from Victoria would be enough to save him. David hesitated only briefly before agreeing, still bitter enough about his own downfall to convince himself that Marcus deserved whatever consequences followed. Richard assured him the plan would be simple, quiet, and untraceable, carried out during a maintenance window when most of the building's security systems would be offline for scheduled updates. Neither man realized that one narrow corridor near the lower level, unrelated to the main system, still had an older camera running independently, a detail neither of them thought to check. As the two men finalized their plan in the quiet of that office, Marcus was at the estate helping Maya glue the final pieces of her science project together, utterly unaware that the ground beneath his new life was about to shift again. He had begun cautiously to believe that things might finally be settling into something stable, something good. Victoria's declaration in front of the entire company had given him a kind of confidence he had not felt in years, a sense that maybe this new chapter of his life was not going to collapse the way so many chapters before it had. He did not yet know how quickly that confidence would be tested, or how far Richard and David were willing to go to make sure it was. The maintenance window came on a Thursday night, exactly as Richard had planned. Most of the building's security systems went dark for scheduled updates, and the halls emptied out well before midnight, leaving only a skeleton crew of janitorial staff moving quietly through the lower floors. Richard used his access clearance to slip into the vault level, David following close behind him with a duffel bag tucked under one arm, both men moving with the kind of careful silence that came from having rehearsed every step in advance. Inside the vault, the diamond pieces meant for the upcoming showcase collection sat displayed in a locked case worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes combined. Richard disabled the case's secondary lock using credentials he was never supposed to share, and within minutes the pieces were gone, wrapped and hidden inside the duffel bag David carried out through a service exit. Neither man noticed the small camera mounted above the corridor outside the vault, an older unit installed years earlier for a maintenance contractor and somehow left out of the system-wide shutdown. The following morning, Richard made an anonymous call to building security claiming he had noticed something unusual near Marcus's office late the previous night. By the time investigators searched the office, they found exactly what Richard and David had planted there, a small velvet pouch tucked behind a filing cabinet containing two of the missing diamond pieces. Marcus was called into a private meeting before he had even taken off his jacket that morning, and within the hour he found himself sitting across from company lawyers instead of Victoria. He tried to explain that he had never even known the pieces existed, that he had no access to the vault level, and that someone must have placed the evidence there deliberately. The lawyers listened politely, but the physical evidence sitting on the table between them carried more weight than his words. By early afternoon, news outlets already had the story, and one headline ran across the bottom of a local broadcast that made Marcus's stomach turn black. Single dad arrested after betraying CEO's trust. It framed him as a man who had exploited a wealthy family's generosity and stolen from the very company that had given him a second chance. Victoria found herself facing pressure from every direction at once. The board demanded an immediate and public response, several members insisting that keeping Marcus employed even during an investigation would damage the company's reputation beyond repair. Reporters camped outside the headquarters and calls poured in from major clients questioning whether Onyx Group's leadership could be trusted to manage its own security. Victoria wanted to believe Marcus completely, and some part of her did, but the evidence in front of her was specific enough to shake even her certainty. Eleanor was the only person in the family who never wavered. She sat with Victoria late one evening, reminding her daughter of the man who had knelt down to speak with an old woman nobody else in that store had bothered to look at twice. She insisted that a man capable of that kind of quiet decency did not suddenly become a thief the moment he was handed real opportunity, and she urged Victoria to keep looking for the truth instead of accepting the easiest explanation. At the estate, the fallout reached Maya faster than Marcus wanted it to. Classmates who had seen the news online began repeating the accusations at school, some outright calling her father a criminal, others simply avoiding her the way children avoid anything that makes them uncomfortable. Maya came home one afternoon with red eyes she tried to hide, insisting nothing was wrong, until Marcus gently pressed her enough that the truth finally spilled out. That night, Marcus sat alone in the dark long after Maya had gone to bed, replaying every decision that had led him to this point, wondering whether accepting Victoria's offer had been a mistake after all. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to find Maya standing in the doorway, unable to sleep, her small frame outlined by the hallway light. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him without saying anything at first, holding on the way she used to when she was much younger and afraid of thunderstorms. "I don't care what anyone says," Maya finally told him. "You're the best person I know, Dad. That's never going to change." Her words did not erase the fear sitting in his chest, but they gave him just enough strength to keep breathing through the next few days. Still watching his daughter suffer because of accusations aimed at him was more than Marcus could bear, silently. He decided that staying at the estate any longer would only pull Victoria further into a scandal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with people trying to destroy him. Before the board could force her hand, Marcus packed a small bag, left a short note, explaining that he did not want to cause her any more damage, and walked out through the estate gates without telling anyone where he was going, taking Maya to stay with an old co-worker across town while he sorted out what to do next. Victoria discovered the note that evening, and the sight of his handwriting, steady even in that moment, broke something loose in her that she had spent years keeping locked away. She refused to accept that this was simply how the story ended, and instead of retreating into the safety the board wanted from her, she threw herself into finding the truth, working late into the night with the company's internal security team, determined to uncover what the surface evidence had conveniently left out. It took nearly a week of careful digging before her security director found the overlooked camera footage from the corridor outside the vault, the one system that had somehow stayed active during the maintenance shutdown. The footage was grainy but unmistakable, showing two figures moving through the vault level, well after hours, their body language and mannerisms, enough for facial recognition software to confirm identities within minutes. Cross-referencing badge access logs from that same night placed Richard and David inside the building at the exact time the footage had captured them. Victoria called an emergency board meeting the following morning, presenting the footage alongside the access records without any warning to either man. Richard tried to argue that the footage was inconclusive, that anyone could have been walking through that corridor for a dozen innocent reasons, but the timestamps and matching entry logs left no real room for doubt. Security escorted him out of the building within the hour, and police were waiting by the time he reached the lobby, having already been contacted based on the evidence Victoria's team compiled. David, questioned separately, broke down almost immediately once he realized Richard would not be covering for him the way he had promised. He confessed to planting the evidence in Marcus's office, explaining in detail how Richard had offered him his old position back in exchange for helping frame an innocent man. By the end of that same day, Onyx Group issued a public statement clearing Marcus of all wrongdoing, confirming that the real culprits had been identified and were now facing criminal charges. Marcus was still staying with his old co-worker across town when Victoria finally found him, having tracked down the address through Eleanor, who had quietly kept in touch with him during the days he had been gone. She knocked on the door that evening, and when he opened it, neither of them said anything for a long moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. "I should have trusted my instincts sooner," Victoria said. "I'm sorry it took this long to prove what I already knew about you." Marcus stepped aside to let her in, and over the next hour they talked more honestly than they had during any of their previous conversations, stripped of the careful distance they had both maintained out of fear of complicating something neither of them fully understood yet. Victoria admitted that her feelings for him were not born from gratitude over what he had done for her mother, but from everything she had witnessed since his patience, his integrity, and the quiet strength with which he loved his daughter. Marcus, who had spent 10 years building walls around his heart in order to focus entirely on Maya, finally allowed himself to acknowledge what he had been feeling for weeks. He told Victoria that he had been afraid to hope for anything more than survival for so long, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to want something purely for himself. Sitting in that small borrowed apartment, neither of them rich in that moment beyond what mattered most, Marcus let himself believe, for the first time in years, that he deserved a future that included more than just endurance. Eleanor welcomed both Marcus and Maya back to the estate, not as guests this time, but as family in every sense of the word. She spent afternoons teaching Maya how to bake the same recipes she had once made for Victoria as a child, and evenings sitting with Marcus on the porch, telling him stories about the early days of Onyx Group before it had grown into the empire it was now. The bond between them felt less like gratitude repaid and more like something that had simply always belonged there, waiting to be recognized. The wedding took place months later, small and unpretentious, despite Victoria's position held in the garden behind the estate, rather than in some grand ballroom downtown. Maya stood beside her father during the ceremony, radiant in a way that made it clear she finally felt the security of a complete family. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the only sound in the garden was the quiet rustle of wind through the trees. And when Marcus and Victoria exchanged their vows, Eleanor cried openly, unashamed of how deeply this moment had been years in the making. Shortly after the wedding, Victoria formally adopted Maya, completing on paper what had already become true in every other sense, and the three of them became at last one family, bound not by circumstance, but by choice. Together, Marcus and Victoria established the Hope Home Foundation, dedicated to supporting abandoned children and the families who chose to adopt them, funding resources that Marcus wished had existed during those uncertain months right after he first found Maya. Victoria also used her position to rebuild the culture inside Onyx Group itself, implementing new standards for how every employee from cashier to executive was expected to treat every customer who walked through the door, regardless of how they looked or what they could afford. Years later, Marcus and Maya returned to the same street corner where he had once found her, wrapped in a soaked towel inside a cardboard box. Maya was taller now, confident, thriving in ways that no longer carried any trace of the fear she had once felt at school. Marcus watched her walk a few steps ahead of him, laughing about something unrelated to any of this, and he found himself smiling at the strange, quiet truth of it all. The same instinct that had once led him to rescue an abandoned infant on a rainy night had years later led him to defend a stranger nobody else in that store had cared to help. And in the end, that single act of kindness, offered without any expectation of return, had given both of them a family and a future neither had ever dared to imagine. If this story reminded you that kindness never really goes unnoticed, that is the whole point of telling it. You never know whose life you might be changing. When you choose to be decent to someone the world has already decided to ignore. If you enjoyed this one, follow the channel so you do not miss the next story, and drop a comment letting us know what you would have done in Marcus's place.